Hello, my name is Nicole Fegan, and I made YouTube videos for about 6 years until one day I stopped. But now, I'm back. If you have been patiently waiting for my return, thank you for waiting. And if you know me from my home life and are wondering to yourself, Nicole Fegan made YouTube videos not only in middle school, but also in high school, and also a little bit in college. Yeah, I did that. There's a lot I can say about what I want to do with this channel, but mostly I've just been getting really into booktube again. During this quarantine, I've been watching people like Paperback Dreams and Chandler Ainsley and Books and Lala, so right now I'm thinking this channel is going to be a booktube channel. So to pay a little homage to the history of this channel and to my past self, this first video will be a reading vlog of my 4 favorite books from high school. The lighting has changed, but starting up we have literary classic Looking for Alaska by John Green. This was my favorite book, definitely in middle school and also for the first bit of high school. I read it, I seriously think like 20 times. It's one of those books that I picked up like every few months back in the 8th grade just to like remind myself that life wasn't terrible all the time. And I'm very excited to see what I think about this in the year 2020 and as a 22-year-old adult woman. Up next we have another YA book, and that is Last Night I Sang to the Monster by Benjamin Alire Saenz. If you know him, you probably know him as the author of Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, but this one was always my favorite. The story spoke to me more. I think the writing is actually a little bit better. And I don't have the highest of hopes for Looking for Alaska, I will admit that, but I actually have pretty high hopes about what I will feel about this one. Then the next 2 books I read in like September and October of the 9th grade, but they stuck with me throughout all of high school. One of them is still one of my favorites today, and the first is Diary by Chuck Palahniuk. If you know Chuck Palahniuk, you probably know him as the author of Fight Club, but he, for whatever reason, was my favorite author throughout all of high school. I have like 6 of his books right here on my shelf, and this is the one that I genuinely thought was the best. And finally, the book that I think the most people in the world associate with me, and that is The Stranger by Albert Camus himself. This is a book I have only read 4 times, but it is so special to me, and that's why I like to space out when I read it. I haven't read it since 2018, and like I was just obnoxiously always talking about this. If you've been subscribed to this channel, you know I've probably talked about it like in 5 or 6 videos. If you know me in real life, you know I don't really shut up about this. So I am again excited to see what I think about this with a couple of years under my belt since I've read it last. So those are the books I will be reading, and let's jump right into Looking for Alaska. Alright, hello, welcome to the bed. I'm 81 pages into Looking for Alaska. I wasn't planning on filming until I finished part 1, but we have things to talk about. Something I like should have expected from this whole process but really didn't was like the absolute rush of nostalgia from reading these things. Like, I read this book like 20 times. Of course it's going to actually feel like what it felt to be in like the 8th grade. And the reason why I so abruptly stopped right now is because I just got to Strawberry Hill Pink Wine, and like there's something about reading a book that you loved when you were younger that like the memories feel like yours. Anyways, I'm not really sure if it's a good book. I will report back when part 1 is over. I always loved part 1 better than part 2 when I was like an actual high schooler, so I will let you know what I thought. So a fun little side note is that another project I'm currently doing is re-listening to every like album, EP, song I've ever heard. Maybe not song, but like every album and EP I've ever heard. And so while reading Looking for Alaska today, I have listened to William Basinski's ambient album, Melancholia, and now I'm listening to Bastille's Bad Blood. I enjoyed the first half more than the second half, but this is the hand that the alphabet has dealt me. So part 1 is over, I have thoughts, and also I realized I've never given a plot summary. If you have somehow made it to the year 2020 without reading or knowing anything about Looking for John Green, it is about Miles Pudge Halter, who has no friends in his town in Florida, and then he goes to a boarding school in Alabama where he meets his roommate, the Colonel, and a friend, Takumi, but most importantly, Alaska Young. Alaska Young is perfect in every way. She smokes cigarettes and reads Gabriel Garcia Marquez and is cool and has her life library of books and is basically everything you could have a wet dream about if you're a junior artsy enough kid in high school. My thoughts so far are that it's made me emotional, but I don't think it would make me emotional if I was a first-time reader, especially if I was like an actual adult human being as a first-time reader. I believe John Green has a quote somewhere, maybe on like one of his Vlogbrothers videos, where he talks about imagining people complexly. But funnily enough, I think the reason that some of his texts appeal to people are that the people aren't always imagined complexly. Everyone has like their talent or their thing. I feel like these people are like a collection of characteristics that you can glom yourself onto if you need that, which sometimes, I mean, I think the reason I read a lot of YA is because when you're young and you're struggling, you need to be able to find yourself sometimes in literature where people get better, or people just at least go through experiences and say, ah yes, I'm like that, maybe the same thing will happen to me. So yeah, liking it enough. Cried a little bit at the end of part 1, you know what I'm talking about, but I think I'm leaning towards like a 3.5. I'll probably end up like 4ing it on Goodreads, but there is still time. Alright everyone, I have finished looking for Alaska. First off, I will be spoiling the plot in this review, so if you don't want to know what happens, you can just skip ahead to the next book. I will have timestamps down in the description. So what happens midway through the book is Alaska dies. She and Pudge and the Colonel are all drunk, and she suddenly is like, oh my god, I gotta go, can you guys make a distraction? And she drives off drunk, and she ends up dying. And basically the entire second half of the book is the other characters trying to figure out whether it was suicide or an accident and whether or not that matters. So I do think that one of the things that this book does really well is that it is a pretty accurate portrayal of how to deal with grief when that grief is kind of looped in with a feeling of responsibility. Like regardless of whether it was suicide or an accident, Pudge and the Colonel both feel incredibly responsible because they could have stopped this, and I think that that's the way John Green portrays that is actually pretty accurate. I also think a lot about, especially with the YA genre, like what message the book sends to its readers, because YA readers are often young teens who are impressionable and developing, and again, like I did, they look to books to kind of guide them through life. So what this book did for me in like the 8th grade was it told me, hey Nicole, maybe don't kill yourself, because if you do, everyone around you will feel terrible. However, to talk about the negatives, I do think that the infatuation with Alaska, even if it's accurate, because like I know what it's like to be completely infatuated with someone and to feel like they're here and my life is better, and if they were gone, things would be worse. So like I get it, but I just don't know if that's something we really still need, especially given that the characters aren't that complex outside of like their very specific personality traits. Like Pudge has this one line where he's talking about how she made him different. He says like, you can't just make me different and then leave. And again, I get that, but I don't know if that's, I guess, the healthiest thing to be telling people. I will probably never pick this up again for the rest of my life, and I also don't totally know if I'd recommend it to a new reader. Like there's so much YA that I think does this better. Like I think I'm gonna give this a 3.5 out of 5, which both honors the fact that it makes me emotional and that I think it has done things for my life, but I'm not sure it's like the #1 book that I would go around praising. So those are my thoughts on Looking for Alaska. The rest of my day is now reading Last Night I Sang to the Monster and listening to The Beach Boys and Beach House. Hello and welcome to yet another wall in my apartment, and now let's talk about the beginning of Last Night I Sang to the Monster. So to give you a brief summary, this is about an 18-year-old Zach who is at an all-ages rehab facility and he doesn't remember how he got there. So the book is kind of just about him trying to remember and him trying to recover and everything that goes down in between. So my initial thought is that I remember less about this book than I thought I did. I really remember like the present of this book, like the characters at the facility and what happens to him there and how he goes throughout this process of like remembering his trauma and all of that. But the beginning of the book especially is mostly in the past tense, and it's mostly all about his memories from childhood and school and growing up. So it's kind of nice to be able to relearn Zach, and he's one of those characters that so much has happened to him. Like if a different writer wrote this book, it would just be trauma porn left, right, up and down. But I think Saenz, what he's really good at in all of his books is creating like really believable, dynamic, and thorough characters. Like the prose can get purple and flowery and it's a little bit pretentious, but at the root of this story I feel like are characters that you understand, that are deep, and Zach especially is someone who I think Saenz treats like an adult. You know, he's at this facility where his two roommates are this 50-year-old man named Raphael and this 27-year-old man named Sharky, and Zach isn't just like some teenage trope, he's an actual human being going through these experiences. So those are my thoughts about the beginning of the book. I will check back in when I have something else to say, or maybe just at the end of this book. But it's beautiful, it is raw, it's kind of funny, and I'm enjoying it so far. Hello everyone and welcome to Tuesday. I went on a 5-mile hike this morning, which was very fun, but my body is completely exhausted. And in other news, I have finished Last Night I Sang to the Monster, and it is still a 5 out of 5 star book. The first thing I want to talk about is something that I briefly touched on when I was talking about Looking for Alaska, which is the responsibility that a book has, specifically a YA book. I am the #1 member of the I Hate Winter Girls fan club, because I loved Winter Girls when I was in high school, and you know why? Because the first 3/4 of the book are just fuel for people who have eating disorders. If Winter Girls has helped you in your life, I am not discounting that, and I think that is very good for you. But even though at the end, like, it's clear that she gets better, I remember being on Tumblr in 2012, like, there were screenshots upon screenshots of that book on that site because it gave you fuel for your problems. And there's something to be said about realism. Like, Winter Girls portrays a girl with an eating disorder pretty well. That's fine. But you know what else portrays someone with addiction very well? Last Night I Sang to the Monster, and it's not just trauma porn of him abusing alcohol and all of the fun times he has with it, and the book isn't just littered with these descriptions that if you're struggling with the same thing he's struggling with, you're gonna relapse. My hatred for other books aside, what I think this book does well is that it is optimistic and hopeful without being naive. Like, this doesn't try to pretend that the process of recovery and remembering trauma is easy, or that it's fun, or that it's always a joy to go down, but its ultimate message, if you will, is that it's necessary and that it's good. I read this for similar reasons that I read Looking for Alaska. I had demons, and I wanted literature that not only reflected my experiences, but also told me, what am I supposed to do? I was 16 and I didn't know what to do, and I wanted someone to just tell me. And of all of the YA books I have read about addiction or substance abuse or depression or something like that, this is simply the most accurate portrayal I can find. It is raw, and it understands what it is like to be a kid in a world where you want to be treated like an adult but also want to be able to feel like a kid. And so my first consideration when reading a YA book about mental illness is it responsible? And it easily passes that test. And then books have style and character, so let's talk about that, because books aren't all just like moral or political or psychological statements. This is incredibly character driven. You learn about Zach, you learn about his therapist Adam, you learn about his roommate Raphael, and you learn about his family. I mean, from point A to point B, not a lot happens, except he is further on his road to recovery. And I seriously just think this book accomplishes that very well. I mean, the #1 adjective I would use to describe the plot is simmering. You follow his incremental recovery and change, and you see his thought processes? And I also think it's very smart that the plot is kind of centered around this remembering, because when you're reading a book, you obviously don't know the plot, and Zach doesn't remember what's happened to him, or he doesn't want to remember what's happened to him, so you're learning Zach just as well as he's learning Zach, and I just think that comes across very beautifully. But that's Last Night I Sang to the Monster. I think this is one of the best YA books I've ever read. I think, again, it's responsible, I think it's beautiful, I think it's moving, I think it's cathartic. And I think the way that Saenz constructs his characters is realistic, and it's tender, and it makes me happy. Hello everyone, and welcome to Thursday. I woke up yesterday on Wednesday, and my body was like, oh no, you're not doing anything today, so instead I watched about, I think, 8 episodes of Survivor Season 32, so that's where we're at emotionally. We're back in front of the Iceland tapestry because it's still daylight, and also I really wanted to show off my slippers. I hope to God you can see what I'm doing. There's sheep on them. Delightfully, the lighting just keeps on changing because of clouds, but I have read the first 50 pages of diary, so let's talk about that. First off, I have the prettiest copy of diary in the world because this little black paint splotches, those were made from a tech night from high school when I was rolling black paint onto a flat and it went onto the book, and I think it makes a cover prettier. So first off, I'm the coolest person in the world? That's not true. And second, to give you a little plot summary, this is about Misty Wilmot, and her husband is in a coma in the hospital after attempting to commit suicide. Wow, the book really isn't even about that at all. It's crazy that that's the basic premise. Misty's husband Peter was a construction worker, and there are all these weird calls that things that he built are disappearing. So like a house that used to have 5 rooms and now it has 4. What's going on there? And similarly spooky things are happening because Misty used to be a painter and then she stopped painting for a while and now she's painting again, almost as if magically. I have this weird pipe dream that I'll be able to finish this book today, but that's absolutely not gonna happen. So I will report back when I have more thoughts about things. So I've read more of Diary and I feel like I misrepresented the plot a little bit and I want to rectify that real quick. I feel like I made it seem as if there was some kind of fantasy element by calling this thing magical, but that's not what's going on at all, I don't think. This is kind of spoiler, but you learn about it pretty early on, so I don't think it's that big of a deal. But Misty's stepmother becomes very overbearing. She starts taking like too much of care of the granddaughter, and she's making all these weird remarks about Misty's life and is like, oh, if you just went back to painting, everything would be okay. Basically, when Misty starts painting again, she can't stop painting. I think that's the reason why I use the word magical. But really what it is that she's probably being drugged by the stepmother. And she also finds this book in the library where she realizes that maybe she's not the first person this has happened to. Like, some context is that Misty grew up really, really poor, and where she's living now is like this very wealthy, high society island. And you kind of realize that there might be this loop of people who have had Misty's background coming to this island and being abused and like maybe with some drugs. So that's all I've got. I am about midway through, and if I work hard enough I might be able to finish tonight, but realistically you will probably get a wrap up from me tomorrow. So it's Tuesday, and what we're not going to do is talk about how long it took me to finish Diary, but we are going to talk about my thoughts. I think this might be the biggest disappointment so far, just based on my expectations versus the reality. It's sitting around a 3.5. I think I'm gonna 4 it on Goodreads, but I could see myself 3ing it if it like stews within me for the rest of the day. So the basic premise of the book, which unfolds throughout the book, is that every 100 years, a young adult man meets an artist woman and convinces her to move to the island until one day they drug her and she paints compulsively, and then she eventually saves the island. Like, it culminates in an art show of her art, and all of the rich people who have come to the island over the summer get killed in a fire, and then all of the locals from the island get the insurance from all of the buildings that have been destroyed, and so now they have money for the next 100 years. This book actually has some things to say about art and legacy and how you can die, but your art will live on. There's things that it's trying to do. But I think its big problem is that it loves explaining itself. Like, all this conspiracy. I mean, the part of the plot is that Misty is writing a diary, and that her current diary will be used in 100 years so that the family of the person in 100 years will know exactly what happens to the next person, because as this has gone on for previous generations, every artist has kept a diary and the events have unfolded the exact same way each time. And I think the problem is that it just thinks it's so very smart. Like, it loves unfolding all of these details, and it loves dropping these like little foreshadowy hints that are, maybe the problem is just that like I'm reading it for like the 5th time, so that these lines that I think were clever to me early on are no longer clever to me now. So yeah, actually after talking about this, I'm gonna go through this on Goodreads, which is very disappointing, but now I get to read The Stranger, so my day is looking up. It's Thursday, I let myself read all morning, and so I am done with The Stranger, and I'm here with some thoughts. First off, to really outline my obsession with this book, I have this copy, I have this copy, I have a graphic novel copy at home, I have a weird $1 SparkNotes thing that I bought from a secondhand shop because I liked that it had little notes in it, and then I have this $50 illustrated version from 1971. So like this, when I say this was my favorite book throughout most of my like young adolescence, I really mean it. The Stranger is about a French Algerian man named Meursault who is characterized by his ambivalence, and midway through the book, this is a spoiler, but it's like the main plot point, he ends up senselessly shooting an Arab man, and then the second half of the book is basically him being on trial. It is still a 5-star book. It's a flawed book, maybe, but it's perfect and it's wonderful. And okay, let's have some real thoughts. The main trajectory of this book is that the first half is characterized by this ambivalent and dangerous and unaware nihilism. Meursault is frequently finding himself in, I was gonna say odd positions, but like genuinely immoral situations, where he is doing things because he is ambivalent about the outcomes. For instance, his neighbor Raymond asks Marceau to write a letter to Raymond's girlfriend so that Raymond can basically assault her, and Marceau sees no problem with that because he has been asked to do something and he will do it because there's no reason not to. And then obviously there's a shooting in the middle of the book, and there's this common thread that there's something very bodily and physical about Marceau that takes over, that eliminates any notion of like mental morality. He says at one point in part 2, I explained to him, however, that my nature was such that my physical needs often got in the way of my feelings. And I think that's very important, that his expression of feeling in part 1 really revolves around this notion of being content, or being not happy or not unhappy. There's this like very middle of the road emotional toll that he takes throughout everything that happens in the first half of the book. And then the middle of the book happens, and he realizes that he can either act or not act. He says, it's where it all started. I knew I'd shattered the harmony of the day, yada yada. It was like knocking 4 times on the door to unhappiness. In this moment where he's completely overtaken by the sun and the heat, he enacts something without being asked about it first, almost as if he's expressing a preference, and that's where his life begins to go poorly. And so the second half of the book is him basically being constantly bombarded with the awareness of his previous nihilism, as he talks to lawyers and prosecutors and the magistrate and the chaplain and just everyone. He starts realizing that he might be guilty and that the way he was living might not be feasible or moral, and that he basically says at the trial that there's a moment where he realizes he was guilty. And the final shift of the book is this shift, I think, this is kind of a new theory on read number 5, this shift from nihilism to Camus' main philosophy, absurdism. In the last like 3 pages, he has this basically explosion with the chaplain where he's like, hey, no, I don't believe in God, and nothing you do is gonna make me think that what I do matters. This is the illustration from the book. Just wanted to show that off because I think it's very beautiful. And like after this massive moment of catharsis, he says, one of my favorite lines in literature, and if that blind rage had washed me clean, rid me of hope, for the first time in that night alive with signs and stars, I opened myself to the gentle indifference of the world. And he's about to get executed, but his first real, genuine expression of actual happiness in the book occurs not with his mindless nihilism, but with his aware absurdism at the end. That like, sure, to believe that nothing matters is a statement that you think something matters, namely that philosophy. It's the key paradox of things like absurdism and existentialism, and that's fine, and I accept it, but I think Camus is kind of trying to say in this way that this key to happiness is in the awareness and the acceptance and the subsequent letting go. So that's my thesis on this book. I mean, I love it. I find more and more to think about each time I read it. I mean, back in high school when I read it for the first time, I was like a strictly apolitical person. And now when I read it, I think there's more I can see about the social commentary and what it's either saying about racism or not saying about racism. I mean, I'd be remiss to mention that the person he shoots in the middle is just characterized as Arab, and there's something very chilling and odd about that, and you kind of can't tell if that's Camus' problem or Marceau's problem. I've read a lot of Camus' nonfiction lyrical essays about Algeria and about the citizens there, so it makes me think that this ambivalence to even the personhood of the Arab, such that he's described chiefly as his race, is an example of Marceau's like lack of awareness and lack of ability to see things complexly, you know? In short, I love this book, and there's kind of a common thread throughout these 4 books that high school was an absolute disaster for me, and I wanted things to tell me that I was going to be okay in some way, and what the stranger told me at, what, 13 or 14, is that I didn't matter, and that my struggles didn't matter, in a good way though, like that there was this larger cosmic indifference, and that I could go through all of the world's good things and all of the world's bad things, and it didn't really matter. So that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much for watching this long-awaited return to YouTube. I'm sure this video is very long, so if you're still here, thank you. I have like 5 or 6 video ideas floating around in my head, so if you're not subscribed yet, please subscribe, and I will be back in a future video talking about books, or movies, or life, or philosophy, or something else equally fun.